Good morning. Last week, you not only learned about the wonderful mission trip to Kentucky, but also about Jacob and his wrestling with God. The week before, we learned about Jacob's father, Isaac, and his grandparents, Abraham and Sarah. This week, I had been hopeful that I might get the next generation, one of my personal favorites, Joseph. I envisioned a wonderful tribute to his coat of many colors, or perhaps his amazing dream interpretations. Instead, my first reading is about the gap. That is, the gap years between the time of Joseph and Moses. In verse 8 of Exodus 1, we are dropped into this gap, and I found it helpful, as you might, to look at the previous two verses, where we receive a short summary covering multiple generations. They record the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to the effect that their posterity would become a mighty nation, innumerable as the stars of heaven, and numberless as the sands of the seashore. To step back a little further for more context, the book of Genesis closed with the status of Israel having been established as that of a relatively small minority, newly immigrated from Canaan, and permitted to dwell in the wild and uninhabited grasslands of Goshen, the Nile Delta. And by reason of the deserved popularity of my favorite, Joseph, whose authority in Egypt at that time was practically unlimited, enjoying the protection of the most powerful government on earth. Exodus begins with all of the basic elements of the picture drastically altered. Israel was no longer small, but mighty. They were no longer free, but enslaved and forced to work for the benefit of an ambitious and powerful Pharaoh. Another king who knew not Joseph had come to power. The same mighty world power that at first had shielded and protected them was at this time their bitter enemy. The time at which this unhappy event took place is not given. We do not know whether or not the new king was of a different dynasty, or if he was merely some successor to the throne who did not regard the history or obligations of previous rulers. In any event, the accession of this unnamed ruler meant the end of all privileges for descendants of Abraham. Even their lands and their liberties were taken away, and they were reduced to slavery and pressed into service as forced labor battalions employed in the ambitious building projects of a tyrannical and unscrupulous monarch. From the human viewpoint, Israel was doomed, their situation being absolutely hopeless. And if this is a typical three-part screenplay of our hero's journey, we exit this first Old Testament reading about 15 minutes into part 1, and we are looking for our hero and the call to action he will at first refuse. Enter Moses and the burning bush. Our second reading from the Old Testament begins with Moses tending sheep. As a little background, some scholars suggest that a little over 60 years have passed between the death of Joseph and the birth of Moses. By the end of Exodus 1, the Pharaoh of Egypt had decreed that all the Hebrew boy babies were to be drowned at birth. Certainly a drastic method to stop all of that multiplying. But when Moses is born, his very clever mother and sister, through the use of what became known as a Moses basket, they send him floating down the Nile to be adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter, who hears his cries and adopts him. And Moses is raised and educated by the Egyptian royalty. But when grown, he observes an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he kills the Egyptian. Fearing he may be discovered, Moses flees to the land of Midian. And back to the screenplay. Here we come to one of our first pivotal scenes. In fact, the burning bush scene in this chapter of Exodus is surely among the top 10 best-known biblical stories. It has been immortalized in countless ways in culture. An entire generation, a little bit older than me, of Americans grew up with Cecil B. DeMille's rendition of it in the epic movie, The Ten Commandments. When looking for some commentary on this chapter, I found an article by Dr. Amy Merrill Willis of the University of Lynchburg, and she provided the following helpful analysis. When we say that God meets us where we are, the implication is that we are not always where we should be, but that God adapts and accommodates us nonetheless. Moses is not necessarily where he should be either. After all, despite his education and upbringing, He's tending not even his own sheep, but his father-in-law's. But the sight of the burning bush, which he noticed, and God's call will bring him out of obscurity and isolation and send Moses back to Egypt to lead the Israelite flock. But even for God, the task of getting Moses back on track is no simple matter. The typical commissioning scene played throughout the Bible involves our prophet's objection to God's commission. The objection highlights the prophet's dependence upon God in undertaking sacred work and reveals an appropriate sense of humility. But Moses is not typical in any sense. Instead of one objection, Moses raises four before saying flat out, to paraphrase, "Please send someone else." It's interesting to note that Moses' first objection was questions his own identity. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Moses is reluctant to take on the role that God asks of him. But really, who better than Moses? His dual identity seems to make him the perfect person to confront Pharaoh for the sake of the Hebrews. What is more, despite his reluctance and his own earlier misguided interventions, he's driven by a deep sense of justice, a desire to intervene for the victimized and the mistreated wherever he sees injustice taking place. And after turning from the question of his own identity, Moses turns to the question of God's identity. When they ask me, what I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord of the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. And in our New Testament reading, Jesus, while responding to the Sadducees and their questioning of resurrection, Jesus directs them back to the story of the burning bush and the power of God. From Mark 12, 26 through 27, now about the dead rising. Have you not read in the book of Moses, in the account of the burning bush, how God said to him, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. This is the word of the Lord.
I think clearly we need Lori to do a sermon on Joseph, since we missed Joseph. So you're on my list, Lori, because that was impressive. Please join me in the spirit of prayer. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. In a reflection posted on Working Preacher, independent scholar Carla Sumala recalls traveling in Japan with her husband. One thing that stood out to her during her travels was shoe etiquette. She says, quote, every time we entered our room, we took off our shoes. Every time we visited a museum, we took off our shoes. Every time we entered a shrine or temple, we took off our shoes. End quote. Upon returning home, Sumala wanted to better understand the Japanese customs around shoes. In her investigation, she found that 98% of the Japanese follow the shoe customs. In one survey she read about the customs, she discovered, quote, 81% of people identified not one but two equally important reasons for taking their shoes off when they enter their homes. Number one, to keep their houses and floors clean. And number two, to be able to relax and be themselves, end quote. Sumala notes that since Moses was in the desert, it seems unlikely that he took his shoes off to keep the desert clean. And additionally, she notes, while some say removing shoes is a sign of respect, I'm not sure if you caught it, but Moses objected 4 times. He wasn't exactly respectful. It's not like he fell down and said, yes, God, whatever you say, God, right? Moses kind of gets into it. And so Samala wonders this, quote, "Is it possible that God tells Moses to take his shoes off because he wants Moses to be himself, to remove all pretense, to be vulnerable and open to what God has to say?" She says, "The closest analogy I can think of is walking into a CEO's office for an important meeting with my shoes off, something I can hardly imagine doing because I would feel too exposed." She goes on to say, here in this text, God lays out the single largest rescue operation in the entire Bible. God could have done it alone, or God could have chosen anyone on earth for the job. But God specifically selected Moses. In doing so, there must have been something about Moses, with all of his flaws, gifts, and unique qualities, that God was interested in using, end quote. There are many aspects of this story that are sermon-worthy, but as we take time to think about who God is calling, this focus caught my attention. When we are called by God, the calling stems from who we already are, not who God wants us to become. God calls us to act in the world based on the unique gifts that have already been bestowed upon us. Every person, a different combination. Every person, a different ability to affect the world. This premise is how I understand engagement here at First Parish. As I encourage you to consider your involvement here over the next year, I want you to understand that I wholeheartedly believe that we are all best served when we serve from our gifts and our strength. Sometimes in church communities, this can feel extremely frustrating. What will happen to X ministry? No one else is willing to do it. And lots of anxiety ensues. But what if instead we thought of it this way? At some point, X ministry may not continue because it's not suited to the gifts of someone in our community. But I wonder, what else will emerge that is suited to the gifts of our community? What if we approached with curiosity instead of preconceived notions about what should happen? Of course, there are times when we are hesitant to get involved at all, even when involvement means using our gifts. Clearly, Moses was not convinced that he was the best person for the job. He argues with God. I suspect that many of us have also consciously or subconsciously argued with God when it comes to using our gifts. Fear can easily block us from following. We make excuses, we imagine what could go wrong, we doubt ourselves, we doubt God. But there's another important lesson to note in this scripture. God hears Moses' fears and offers relationship. God responds to Moses and says, "I will be with you." And later, God pairs Aaron with Moses so that Moses has the support he needs to carry out his task. Relationships are what enable us to move through fear and live into our gifts. And so I believe relationships are the bedrock of what makes us a church. It's not the building. Here in the United Church of Christ, it's not about a specific way of understanding God. But what it is about is understanding the power of relationships to enable us to live authentic lives. The power of relationships to support us so that we are brave enough to take off our shoes and bring who we are to the world. The power of relationships to remind us that not only are we enough just as we are, but we are beloved children of God. We have been given gifts to offer, but not one of us has all the gifts. So we intentionally gather in community, calling each other forward, celebrating what we have been given by God, and discerning how God is calling us to be in the world. May God bless us on this journey. Amen. Morning offering.